Okay. Weeks ago, and we were talking about this very the HBCU rescue of Jews, and I'm like, dude, you got to give a talk on this, and he agreed, and so we're really, really lucky to have him here to give this talk. I met Carlton a few years ago at Oxford University, where he was lecturing and helping teach a bunch of us pedagogical skill sets against anti-Semitism. So the guy knows a lot. Carlton is speaking tonight on It Would Have Been Enough, which is a term we say in our seders, dayenu, which means if only this would have been enough. And this, during the World War II era, analysis and implications. Dr. Long is a Rhodes Scholar, a former professor at Columbia University, the Chief Education Officer of Lawrence Long and Company, and the co-author with Amherst professor Femi Ovan on the forthcoming book, Mannish Waters, which is a book of, is it 20 African-American men writing about
that? Is right. That is right. Author ethnographic essays. That's right.
Author ethnographic. So it's going to be a really compelling book. Who's publishing it again?
Lexington Books, and it will be out this year.
Okay, I'm excited about that. Carlton, I now turn it over to you.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much, Stephen. You know, Stephen is my colleague and friend. And speaking of books, he is also my co-author. Yes. I'm his co-author in a forthcoming book, and more on that as it develops. I also, of course, would like very warmly and heartily to thank Edwin and Cynthia Johnson, and of course, Jewish Studies there at Gettysburg College. I also, of course, would be remiss if I didn't thank every single person who has taken out your time to be present with us today in fellowship and study. So I thank you all for that. Yes, so it would have been enough. The role of HBCUs, or historically Black colleges and universities, in accepting Jewish refugees during the World War II era, analysis and implications.
I got it.
This talk has been arranged, I should tell you, to go from the personal to the political. So I will lay a groundwork in terms of some of the key themes. I will tell you a little bit more about myself, and all of those things ultimately should speak to our topic today, which I will take on midway quite heartily, and that will be the detail of this very fascinating history with regard to what were called refugee scholars coming to the United States from Austria and Germany during the World War II era, and settling and being welcomed and received at historically Black colleges and universities. It is a fascinating story, and I have been amazed to begin to unpack it, and have had a couple of wonderful and spirited conversations with Stephen about this in the past. And so this is the first product of those conversations and thoughts, and I'm happy to share that with you all today. So, in the history of our world, human beings seem to spend a lot of time fleeing. Not fleeing.
But they have to be white.
I'm sorry?
No, someone came onto the screen, and keep going.
Oh, okay.
I apologize.
Oh, no. Okay, all right. So in the history of the world, human beings seem to spend a lot of time fleeing, not simply fleeing wild animals and natural disasters, although those instances are certainly true. But over the course of thousands of years, we sadly have spent an inordinate amount of time fleeing from one another. The simplicity of this remarkable yet sobering observation gives rise to credence to another observation made over 2,000 years ago. An observation widely attributed to the ancient Roman playwright Titus Maccius Plautus, Homo homini lupus. His Latin phrase translating roughly as man is wolf to man. Homo homini lupus. The current catastrophe, which the entire international community is observing in Eastern Europe, quickly springs to mind. Other conflicts, such as those in Ethiopia, the Middle East, Central America, South Asia, down to our fractured society here in the United States, also come to mind. And that list could, of course, go on and on. With human nature being as paradoxically simple and complex as many of us have found it to be, my hunch is that neither wolf-like behavior in hegemons or villages, nor courage in the persons who are assailed and marginalized is ever in short supply. Let us make no mistake, fleeing is often a courageous act. The fight or flight construct is useful, but perhaps not controlling. In fact, flight can be seen as a strategic response that has ensured the survival of individuals and groups and led to the building of societies, cultures, and nations. One can, of course, always go on to live to fight for another day. And not for nothing, the fight or flight option has also given us riveting episodes of Finding Your Roots with Skip Gates on PBS. As I said, a bit of the personal into the political. So a bit more about me. I am by training a political scientist, although this presentation will have something of an historical bent. And this means, among other things, that I'm profoundly animated by questions of power and authority, social contracts, social compact, government, laws, norms, institutions, social change, and more. I come particularly alive around questions of equity, justice, morality, ethics, human rights, individual rights, civil liberties, and the general conditions of marginalized and oppressed people. People whom the towering, famous Black preacher and theologian, as well as philosopher, Howard Thurman poignantly referred, the disinherited. I am similarly especially concerned with the way that race is socially constructed and reified, or as sociologists Michael Homey and Howard Winant insightfully have termed it, fabricated in the United States and elsewhere around the globe. I should add that Homey and Winant's major 1986 publication, Racial Formation in the United States, is definitely worth perusing with regard to such problematic. I'm very mindful of the social construction of race because of scholars such as Homey and Winant, and also because of one of my great mentors, the late British anthropologist, Juliet F. Blair, a leader with Dr. Barbara Harrell Bond of the Refugee Studies program at Oxford. Therefore, whenever a public opportunity presents itself, I tend to lean in on interrogating the idea of biological racial fixity and asserting that race is, in the context of Homo sapiens at least, concurrently real and unreal, a veritable paradox. Race is unreal, of course, in terms of the pseudoscientific taxonomic claims that have been asserted for centuries by Gobineau and others. However, race is all too real in its societal, pedestrian definitions and functions. In other words, the grossly imprecise and somewhat utilitarian social constructions, which we idiomatically rather casually share today. For example, he's a white guy, she's a Black woman, more often than not, quite powerfully graft racial meaning upon our world, ourselves, and upon one another, based essentially on rather wobbly and mercurial social, but not firmly biologically scientific categories. In other words, we are prisoners to phenotypes. These racial social constructions have explicitly been encoded in Western scientific literature since the early 1800s. Some have roots dating back, of course, to anti-Semitism of the Middle Ages. Anti-Semitism being, of course, as it has been widely observed, the oldest hatred. These social constructions still rule the day, and 21st century Americans especially operate by and large within racial idioms and vocabularies which are arguably both obsolete and incompatible with contemporary science. The question of race also collides with ethnicity and notions of Jewish identity in ways which are starkly similar to the way in which it collides or functions vis-a-vis Black and white and other categories. It is revealing that with regard to public transportation, for example, some public buses in Nazi Germany held seats in the rear reserved for Juden, and seats in the front reserved for Nicht-Juden or non-Jews. See, for example, the film From Swastika to Jim Crow. Given our collective human history of lived interactions which are solitary, nasty, brutish, in short, homo homini lupus, one is tempted sometimes to ask, where is the hope for humanity? Moreover, how have human beings, especially in times of turmoil, aided one another beyond the perceived borders of individual or group identity? The example I would like to present to you today concerns the Black and Jewish experiences and interactions in the United States. More specifically, the role of HBCUs in accepting Jewish refugees during the World War II era. Essentially, the relationship between African-American administrators, faculty members, and students of historically Black colleges and universities vis-a-vis Jewish refugees, particularly those from Germany and Austria during the Second World War. A conversation today about persons fleeing seems particularly apt, given the crises which abound, and of course, the current Passover season. You know, many years ago, I lived in New York City, and I was invited to a Passover Seder in the Park Slope neighborhood of Brooklyn. I had never attended a Seder before, and was therefore honored and perhaps more than a little curious to immerse myself wholeheartedly into a completely new experience. It was a cultural event for me, something which seemed especially fitting since I was at the time a teacher of global history in a multicultural, multi-ethnic public high school on the Lower East Side of Manhattan, where one of the key themes from the unit I taught was the concept of cultural diffusion. Toby, the assistant principal at the time, was a Jewish woman, an artist, who had enthusiastically hired me and had taken a special interest in not only my social science training, but also my love of art. Toby was the host of the Passover Seder. Of course, I was quite familiar with her, but in truth, I knew absolutely no one else who had gathered in the quiet and quaint Brooklyn brownstone for this annual familial ritual, one which soon struck me as a Christian as particularly welcoming and warm, a place of faith, honor, gratitude, sharing, and remembering. I was a stranger, but I felt welcomed. That experience was important to me and continues to be important to me for many reasons. A basic personal one was that, I grew up as the youngest member of a family of 10 children. And so I rather loved the idea that were I in a Jewish household, I would have been tasked with the first question of asking, why is tonight different from any other night? But on other levels, I was also deeply touched by the Seder invitation and experience because of the powerful moral and ethical example that it set, that how it touched upon something very familiar to me, something that Martin Luther King talked about in terms of building a beloved community. Especially with someone who might very easily be seen as the other. The other. Well, refugees have certainly been that in history. It's been well documented that between the years of the rise of the Nazi Party in 1933 and the culmination of World War II in 1945, that about 250,000 refugees arrived in the United States, mostly Jews from Europe. According to the United Nations 1951 Convention relating to the status of refugees, the single endorsed definition of the term refugee is as follows. A refugee, according to the convention, is someone who is unable or unwilling to return to their country of origin owing to a well-founded fear of being persecuted for reasons of race, religion, nationality, member of a particular social group, or political opinion. The emphasis of this definition is on the protection of persons from political or other forms of persecution. The United States has long represented itself, of course, as a beacon of democratic hope and freedom of liberal ideals to the citizens of the world, welcoming to strangers. And this grand message, like the Statue of Liberty, was not lost on the earnest refuge-seeking populations of wartime Europe. To be expected, of course, given the times, the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum makes clear the less than seamless transition for the Jewish refugees into the American landscape. And I quote, after Germany annexed Austria and Czechoslovakia, hundreds of thousands of people, mostly Jews, applied to immigrate to the United States. It became more difficult to secure a US immigration visa as a result of America's national security concerns, the difficulty of obtaining affidavits, and a fine number of visas and travel options. Moreover, President Franklin D. Roosevelt took significant but limited actions to aid Jewish refugees during the period, and yet he was concurrently, it was observed, mostly concerned with preparing the United States for war. And the American public placed little pressure on the president or the Congress to increase immigration to aid the European Jews. Private relief organizations, however, assisted thousands of Jewish refugees. Given the growing problem of xenophobia today, it is useful as we move forward into the HBCU conversation for us to unpack just for a moment and etymologically the word xenophobia, and to unpack it in the context of the very rich Jewish religious tradition. From an etymological point of view, xenophobia literally means fear of the stranger. The Passover Seder, by contrast, encourages the welcoming of the stranger. Not simply the welcoming of a stranger on some roadside or in some other public space, but rather into one's home, to one's table, to one's shared food and fellowship, and into an expanded sense of human community. Well, a welcoming, historically Black college and university community was very, very well prepared to understand this kind of welcome and to understand the problem of discrimination, to understand ultimately also a sense of empathy. So what are historically Black colleges and universities? Historically Black colleges and universities are profoundly important and profoundly American institutions of higher learning. While many Americans recognize a few of the most salient names of HBCUs, such as Howard University, the alma mater, of course, of the current Vice President of the United States, Hampton University, the alma mater of Booker T. Washington, Spelman College, Morehouse College, the alma mater of Martin Luther King, and many others, Tuskegee and Fisk, there are, in fact, actually nearly 100 HBCUs in existence. They overwhelmingly reformed during the Reconstruction era and as places to educate formerly enslaved Africans, or what were called freedmen, might also say freed women, in the immediate wake of the Civil War. I try to help some people to understand HBCUs when they don't understand them, but they understand other American institutions by making an analogy. I say HBCUs are rather like, in some ways, the seven sister colleges, the elite places known as Wellesley, Smith, Bryn Mawr, Vassar, Mount Holyoke, Barnard, and Radcliffe. HBCUs are profoundly useful and productive today, and they are very much like these institutions in terms of the American historical landscape. That is, they both represent institutions and opportunities for people who were closed out of access. The Seven Sisters, of course, having been created to allow space for very often privileged white, quote unquote, white women in the United States along the Northeast to receive the kind of quality education that men received in the Ivy League. The HBCUs have been designed in order to help people who were also closed out, who had no opportunity. And this was for many of them the way up. The HBCUs faced a threat, however, that the Seven Sisters did not. To give you more of a sense of their importance and the threat that they've endured, including current threats, which the FBI is investigating. Fisk University in Nashville, Tennessee, just by way of example, was purposely built in 1866 upon a hill so that the members of the Fisk learning and teaching community could see from far off if vandals, if Klansmen were approaching to burn or otherwise attack the institution and its people. The HBCUs were, by and large, the primary and sometimes only network for higher education for very, very many African Americans and Afro-diasporic immigrants from the Caribbean, from Africa and elsewhere. And this has been so since the late 19th century and into the 20th century, indeed until today, for very, very many Black populations, but also for diverse persons as well who do not fit the description of quote unquote Black. The HBCUs were the #1 stopping ground for a people who were shut out, by and large, from the predominantly white institutions, or as they are sometimes called, the PWIs. I'd like to say then that the HBCUs, rather like the Seven Sisters, are, from a metaphorical point of view, rather like museums and libraries. The HBCUs have served an historical function, and we should learn and see where we were. Yet at the same time, they're very active and vibrant and present today, as libraries are as well for our teaching and learning. And the same is true for the Seven Sister Colleges. HBCUs have graduated the masses of the Black middle class for generations, including most African-American leaders of the civil rights movement. So given the HBCU community's longstanding familiarity with racism, anti-Black hatred, and overall racial and ethnic discrimination in America, they were particularly well suited to welcome Jewish professors and scholars who had been rejected and ill-treated because of racism, religious prejudice, anti-Semitism, and anti-Jew hatred in Europe in general, and Germany and Austria in particular. So between 1933 and the culmination of the war in 1944, it should not come as a surprise that there were, as even the Manchester Guardian routinely documented, massive dismissals of professors, scholars, and artists, which began in Germany as early as April of 1933. Over 5,000 scholars, including 80 female scientists and mathematicians, sought the help of the Emergency Committee in aid of displaced foreign scholars in order to receive placement in the United States during the war. The committee eventually aided scholars throughout Nazi-controlled Europe. The Emergency Committee in aid of displaced scholars was also funded, supported by the Rockefeller Foundation. As has been observed, the Emergency Committee in aid of displaced foreign scholars assisted scholars who were barred from teaching, who were persecuted and threatened with imprisonment by the Nazis. The program began in Germany soon after Hitler took power and expanded to include Austria, Czechoslovakia, Norway, Belgium, the Netherlands, France, and Italy. Some of whom, and some of the scholars who left actually became Nobel laureates and had come from diverse areas in literature, medicine, and physics. In fact, the work and ideas of many of the refugee scholars assisted by the Emergency Committee helped shape the post-war world. It does appear that of the nearly 2,000 refugee scholars who arrived in the United States and were placed at institutions from Hebrew universities to Harvard, some 50 or so began teaching careers in historically Black colleges and universities. And they had credentials which were competitive. It's interesting also to notice that for those who have studied refugees and placement in American universities at large, especially during World War II, there's often a consensus that those with the most compelling academic credentials, portfolios, recommendations and such were, of course, seen as particularly viable for placement in the most elite institutions. Interestingly, many of the persons who had applied and received placement at the historically Black colleges and universities were part of a younger set in terms of their careers, and also sometimes even in terms of their facility with language. There were some refugee scholars who came to the United States with little or no facility with the English language. And yet they were welcomed, and yet they were accommodated, and yet they learned the English language, and they built careers within the historically Black college and university system. They had faced huge bureaucratic obstacles related to the immigration in the United States, including the necessary production of bona fides, including certificates, statements, affidavits, entry and exit visas, and more. It was understood that anti-Semitism and racial discrimination were routinely and boldly asserted in American culture, institutions, and life. Some Black college presidents, such as James E. Shepard, former pharmacist and theologian, and who was also president of North Carolina Central University, at that time known as North Carolina College for Negroes, advocated relentlessly for hiring refugee scholars and aiding them in their becoming acclimated to life in America and life in the American segregated South. More detailed accounts can be found in Gabrielle Edgecombe's book entitled From Swastika to Jim Crow. And there is, of course, a fascinating documentary of the same name, which has been produced by Stephen Fischler and Joel Sucher. And these all serve as a great primer to this kind of conversation. Again, from swastika to Jim Crow. Well, looking more closely at the refugee scholars, their HBCU institutions and their Black students can be very instructive. John Hertz was professor of political science at Howard University, hired by Ralph Bunche in 1941. Hertz worked as a political analyst for the US State Department and was a member of the US delegation to the Nuremberg trials. Hertz coined the concept of security dilemma and also helped draw a plan for democratizing the occupation zone in Germany. Another refugee scholar, Ernst Moritz Manasse, taught German, Latin, and philosophy at what was then the North Carolina College for Negro, again, North Carolina Central University. He arrived, he's on record as saying that he was going to teach at this institution for maybe a year, maybe two, possibly three. He ended up teaching at North Carolina Central University from 1939 until 1973, turning away an opportunity to leave NCCU and to teach and stay at Princeton. He taught, by the way, a young William Jackson and doggedly encouraged him to apply for a Fulbright scholarship. Jackson received it and eventually became the chair of the German department at the University of Virginia. Jewish refugee scholars, Black students in HBCUs. Dr. Ernst Berensky taught at Tougaloo College, where he mentored many, including Joyce Ladler, a noted sociologist and civil rights activist who ultimately became a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. When Ladler did not have funds to apply to go to graduate school, Berensky paid for her application fee. At the end of her graduate school career, upon completing the oral defense for her PhD, she promptly notified Berensky of his success. At that point, apparently he sent her a check for $100 and said, take your friends out to dinner, you all deserve it. And there was Dr. Fritz Pappenheim, who taught economics to a future sociologist, Calvin C. Hampton. When Hampton subsequently wrote the book, White Papers for White Americans, he dedicated it to the memory of Dr. Pappenheim, whom he tearfully recalls in the documentary on refugee scholars, when he reflects on his life and the death of Dr. Pappenheim before Hampton's book is published. Professor and painter Victor Lowenfeld helped convince one of the greatest artists in African-American history, John Biggers. He convinced John Biggers, who was then at Hampton Institute, later and now Hampton University, to set his sights higher than being a plumber. Biggers had applied to Hampton University and had submitted drawings of pipes and accessories to plumbing as part of his admissions portfolio. Once he was encountered by the very well-established refugee scholar and artist Victor Lowenfeld, Biggers was encouraged to pursue art. Not only to pursue art, but to make a career of it in terms of instruction as well. So not only did Vickers become, by any measure, one of the most famous American muralists of all time, but he also accepted Lowenfeld's further challenge to pursue a doctorate and to teach art, all of which Vickers achieved. The most distinguished and celebrated refugee scholar in the United States at the time was, of course, Albert Einstein, who had earlier accepted a position to teach at Princeton University and who decided upon Hitler's rise to chancellor in 1933 not to return to fulfill what was already established as a joint appointment with the Prussian Academy of Sciences in Berlin. Although famed scientist Albert Einstein's refugee status was not explicitly tied to an historically Black college and university, the discrimination he faced at Princeton left him to commune with local African-American students and families in segregated Princeton, New Jersey. And he also was later granted and accepted an honorary degree from Lincoln University, an historically Black college and university. I mentioned that he accepted the degree because Einstein is on record for having thought that honorary degrees were rather ostentatious, but he did agree to accept one from the historically Black college and university, Lincoln University, aptly named Lincoln, of course. While at Lincoln, Einstein met with a group of Black students, and I believe you may have seen that photograph in the flyer which announced this talk. But Einstein also has a rather beautiful quote in terms of his observation of the American social, political, quote unquote, racial, ethnic landscape. Einstein says, "There's a separation of colored people from white people in the United States. That separation is not a disease of colored people. It is a disease of white people. I do not intend to be quiet about it." That was part of his commencement speech. Civil rights. And this is kind of how I really began this thinking about this talk. So often there's a prevailing narrative about the Black and Jewish relationship and alliance. And it is rooted largely, the conversation very often starts with the civil rights movement. But it's really very nice for us to be able to locate a conversation a little bit earlier, and that is in the World War II era, where we saw much more mutuality and such than what ultimately occurred at the end of the civil rights movement. Still, much has been written and discussed regarding the alliance which existed between Blacks and Jews during the civil rights movement. Richard Kluger's classic volume, Simple Justice, for instance, highlights the breadth and depth of the alliance as individuals and groups, secular and religious, collaborated to bring about the Brown versus the Board of Education decisions of 1954, and of course, the implementation decree of 1955. The Black and Jewish alliance towards Brown was also built in hopes of establishing what was regarded as a colorblind society based upon non-discrimination against individuals and groups, irrespective, of course, of race, creed, color, religion, ethnicity, or national origin. In corollary fashion, scholar Mark Dollinger has written boldly about the fissures which have existed and have been since the 1960s, particularly exacerbated. Dollinger's book, Black Power, Jewish Politics, Reinventing the Alliance in the 1960s, at the same time examines ways in which some American Jewish support of Black militancy and separatism further informed the emergence of a new form of American Zionism. In short, Dollinger seems to assert that Black Americans and Jewish Americans, since the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and since the landmark Brown decision, in a dynamic form of what participating in what some pedagogues might refer today as I might refer to today as reciprocal teaching. That Blacks and Jews were engaged in some form of reciprocal teaching from a political point of view. While it is certainly a defensible and philosophically liberal idea to argue that individuals and groups possess the right to self-identification, it is also the case, as scholar Karen Broder has asserted, that dynamics exist within a social milieu, irrespective of the way that individuals and groups define themselves. She refers to this in part as the, quote, historical changes in Jewish racial assignment. Very much related, the complicated issue of passing for white, or by shorthand, just passing, is interestingly a documented and sometimes openly discussed phenomenon in both Black American history and social circles and Jewish American history and social circles. Karen Broder's 1998 book, How Jews Became White Folk and What That Says About Race in America, is instructive in this regard. So too is Bliss Boyar's powerful 2008 book, One Drop, My Father's Hidden Life, A Story of Race and Family. Not altogether unrelated has been the cleavage which emerged in Black and Jewish political alliances surrounding the piecemeal, decades-long national cobbling together of a coherent and recognizable affirmative action policy. A policy itself, which some may argue is a natural phenomenon of non-discrimination, a natural epiphenomenon of non-discrimination policy. That is, to enforce and assure non-discrimination. Affirmative action proponents have argued it is necessary for the national government to not only trust, as it were, but also to verify. To verify through data, as well as outreach, admissions, hiring and promotion policies, to do all these things through data and oversight to ensure that non-discrimination was and is, in effect, showing up at work. That non-discrimination is and was showing up in boardrooms. And that non-discrimination was and is showing up in school. That it is not truant. That it is especially in Americans' powerful institutions of higher learning, very much present. Nathan Glazer, sociologist and son of Jewish immigrants from Russia, advanced some searing, but also some of the most eloquent critiques of affirmative action, many of which he recanted prior to his death. He spoke of Jewish antipathy for quote unquote quotas, for example, and what quotas meant semantically and practically to American Jews prior to the creation of affirmative action policy. He also spoke to a veritable Jewish uneasiness for obvious reasons with regard to the ethnic and racial tracking and documentation of people. Despite the numerous examples of Black-Jewish collaboration during the Civil Rights Movement, say, for instance, the founding of the NAACP, Joel Elias Spingarn, Freedom Riders, March on Washington, interfaith clergy leadership and collaboration with Martin Luther King, and countless other sung and unsung heroes. It still might credibly be argued in some ways that actually some of the measurable civil rights successes of the Jewish-Black alliances may have contributed to the undoing of, shall we say, the special relationship. That is, again, it might be argued that some of the successes of the Black and Jewish alliances may have unwittingly contributed in some way to the undoing of that special relationship. Let's talk about that in terms of then and now. Many political observers will certainly assert that tensions, as well as fissures or cleavages in any political alliance, ought to be taken seriously. despite the substantively profound and symbolically profound, and yet at some moments, symbolically superficial similarities between the Black and Jewish experiences, deeper conversations can still be had. I mean, there are those symbolic similarities, and there are many. Just a few: Abrahamic faith, slavery, liberation, Exodus, Egypt, Moses, de facto and de jure discrimination, unthinkable horrors, unthinkable death, unthinkable murder, night, authoritarian, fascist state power, white supremacy, Nazism, the Klan, the struggle for non-discrimination law, HBCUs and refugee scholars, the civil rights movement, the language of ghetto brought from Warsaw to Harlem, and much, much more. Despite all this, real tensions have existed and continue to exist. So before we close, there does remain a genuine project, I should think, for all of us to attend to, currently and in the future. Black anti-Semitism does exist, and anti-Black Jewish racism does exist. From a realpolitik perspective, these failures, and they are profound failures, while never excusable, might well be understood within the context of human society. In essence, we're beginning now to end where we began. Human beings, sadly, can be wolves to one another. A huge challenge, it seems to me, is for us to recommit to overcoming. If we do this, we can perhaps reclaim that special relationship, a wonderful phrase, which after all is gloriously shared by the United States and Britain. And this notion of a special relationship, of course, denotes the profound partnership which has existed and grown between the UK and the United States, but particularly since World War II. Both the US and the UK see ourselves as participating in this special relationship. And just think, our fundamental relationship with Britain was actually born out of kinship, then division, and then war. Alliances thrive because unity works. Theologian Howard Thurman pushes this concept even further and globally, speaking of the insights that he and his fellow parishioners gained from their amazing work in building in California the Church for the Fellowship of All Peoples. Thurman said, "We discover something, that the experience of unity between people, the experiences of unity between people are more important than and crucial than all of the concepts, prejudices, ideologies, hate that may divide. And if you can multiply these experiences of unity over a time of sufficient duration, you can undermine any value that separates one human being from another." End quote. Certainly there is hope for improved Black-Jewish political relationships in the US and around the world. The death angel can pass by both of our doors. So let me thank you all again for this wonderful invitation to speak and share these thoughts and considerations with you. And also thank you all very much for your kind attention throughout this Passover talk. May I end this talk with building even a bit more further with something of a glorious interfaith Judeo-Christian metaphor, the door. My faith tradition tells me that Jesus Christ stands at the door and knocks. The Jewish tradition tells us that at the end of the Passover Seder, we should leave the door open for Elijah, and one day also the Messiah. May I share with you, my friends, a bit more about my own idiosyncratic, perhaps, theological insight. I come from a very liberal theology, which informed me that there are, per an old Negro spiritual, 12 gates to the city. Hallelujah. May we all attend with great, great care to our hearts and our fellow human beings. And may we all, with great, great care, attend to the door that has meaning for us. Thank you.
Carlton, oh my goodness. What a tapestry you wove together for us. You brought in so many things and organized it in such a beautiful way that, yeah, we're going to have to put this talk on YouTube with your permission. I'm serious. I'm certainly going to show it on Facebook. Thank you so much. Before we begin the questions, I want to tell people there's no question that's too pedestrian to ask Carlton. Carlton's an educator. He works with young people. This is what he's devoted himself to. And so he is ready to field any question that you may have, whether about his talk or independent from his talk, that you think he may understand and be able to ask. But I'll begin the questions with the question. Could you tell us a little about, I think, let me begin with the comment, then the question. I'm not sure Americans understand the relationship Hitler felt toward the United States and his Nazi, other Nazi leaders. Could you talk to that a little bit and how Hitler looked to the U.S. laws regarding Jim Crow?
Well, from what I've understood, and again, I'm coming at this from a kind of political science point of view. My understanding is that the Nazis, through Hitler, really looked to justify some of their policies based upon what the United States had done. I mean, I think that example of Jews at the back of the bus is instructive. And we have seen these kinds of justifications, not just in kind of ethno-nationalist racist states, such as Hitler's Germany, but also think about when South Africa was a pariah state, and how it looked very often to the U.S. as a justification for how the American South got things right. And so aside from Hitler's disdain for democracy and the liberal values and the pluralism that the United States represented, I think it's clear that the United States, the way that United States did hatred was attractive.
Do you, in a follow-up, people get very nervous talking about white supremacy in our politics today, when there's actually a long history of it that, as you just noted, was imitated by the Nazis, in part, in terms of learning how to legally.
I'm having a little trouble hearing you, Steve, so can you speak a little bit more into the microphone? I was just having a little trouble with that. Second question.
Okay, is this better?
Yes, it is.
Okay, great. When we talk about today in the United States, we often see ourselves as against Hitler. And we often are unaware, as you just noted, that the Nazis looked to the United States, to Jim Crow laws, kind of imitated them, or not kind of, did imitate them to segregate Jews. And we have a long history of white supremacy. And I wonder if you could, I liked your ending about we can overcome. That was really beautiful. I wonder if you could speak to that a little bit with the students in mind.
Well, I do think that we have a wonderful opportunity to unpack our identities with rigor. And that is why I have problematized, and I'm not alone in this, of course, the concept of race. I don't feel as though we do enough, even in social science literature, to problematize it. Very often, very thoughtful, rigorous thinkers in the social science discuss race as something of a fixity, and that's an enormous oversight, I would argue, along with Omi and Winan and many others, because especially if we harness, say, what we know about haplogroup science today, and all the different histories which we possess genetically, based upon our years of biological history, we can begin to understand that we really are not discrete races of people. And if people can really break through that concept, which we kind of accept and say, yeah, I know the person is really black, person is really white. There's a part of us which kind of secretly has been conditioned to like, you're really, really black. And of course, that is a black person. And that's core, that is a white person. At the core, this is a biological identity. And it's informed also by some of the ways in which race has been discussed in our religious texts, in social history, in decrees since the Middle Ages, and of course, since the phrenologists and the pseudo-scientific racists of say the 1800s and such. So we have a lot, I would argue, to unpack. And if we begin to unpack that with rigor, it's kind of like Du Bois said, the problem of the 20th century is the color line. It seems almost in some ways that we could argue that the problem of the 21st century is the unpacking of these social constructions, the unpacking of the race concept. And therefore, I would argue probably the exploding of it towards a genuine and biologically more justifiable human definition of family. I think there's real pay dirt there for us, not just in terms of understanding social science, but really in terms of practical application.
Oh, wow. Thank you for those great answers. I'm going to open the floor up. I saw Professor Gimbel had his hand up, and then you can all unmute yourselves now. I've released the locking you in. So I'm going to open the floor after Steve asks, and Carlton, I'll allow you to pick the people.
Okay. Well, I'm fine for whoever. I don't see a person here, so
Steve has got one.
Okay, great.
Well, first of all, thank you for a wonderful talk. Despite the fact that it's Passover, you rose to the occasion. So 2 questions, actually, around the phrase fight or flight, which is sort of where you began. I'll have a flight question and a fight question. The flight question, I really loved the way the talk began with this idea that flight is, in fact, a creative, brave act. We often see it, juxtaposed against fight, right? It's the brave who stand and fight. It's the coward who runs away. But in fact, fleeing, as you point out, you're fleeing into the unknown with a hope in order to create a life. And it allows the sort of hybridization of cultures. And it is a wonderful thing. But what's fascinating is the Black American experience is one of the few that wasn't allowed this notion of fleeing, right? That the Jews could flee in hopes of finding a better life. Whereas when you look at the history, Black Americans were brought here, not pursuing a greater future, but treated as mere objects. And so it seems that the openness to accepting these Jewish refugees as professors is an act of tremendous kindness. We were called on during Passover to remember that you were once slaves in Egypt, and therefore you should pay it forward and treat others, treat the stranger as you're glad you've been treated. In this case, you're actually describing a situation where these refugees were treated better than the people who were extending the kindness. And so that seems to make it really an extraordinary act of kindness. And so that's sort of the flight part of the comment or question. The fight part, Karen Brodkin's book is wonderful. And one of the things she points out, I think, importantly, is that the real cleavage between the Black and Jewish communities in America, you're right, happens after World War II, where you have a large number of Jewish and a large number of African Americans who fight in Europe and in Asia, return home, and then the GI Bill is put forward, but is put forward in a way that is incredibly unfair. And as a result, Jewish veterans have access to education and low rate mortgages, which start to allow for the accumulation of generational wealth, which is explicitly denied to Black veterans. And so is that baking in? I think this is one of the things Brodkin argues, is that we've now sort of baked into the structure the sort of economic inequity that will make the sort of hopefulness at the end of the talk more difficult. How can we overcome that? I guess this is the fight part of the question.
Well, thank you, Steve. Rich question. I hope I can begin to do it some service. With regard to how we might be able, maybe I can start at the beginning and work my way to the front. Ways in which we might begin to, as if overcome, I think is to try to work genuinely with notions of bringing our all to the table in our lives, and so that if there is more access, if there are more resources on one side of the table, as we saw differentially in the HBCU and scholar situation, then we bring it all together. I mean, they're fascinating. I encourage anyone who hasn't seen the documentary; they're available on YouTube. I had great joy studying them and taking notes from the amazing stories which were shared, so that I could continue to build on my own knowledge and to share in some kind of coherent way this amazing story with you, and to juxtapose with things that I have studied for many years. For instance, when I was at Oxford, my research was on affirmative action in the United States compared to what the British called positive action. So that's a policy that I've lived with for decades. And that's related to your question too, Stephen, because if we are truly allies, then sometimes we might be able to perform in some spaces differently from how our partner can. I remember, one of the things that I do is I help students to prepare for the world of prestigious scholarships. And that's in part because I was privileged enough to become a Rhodes Scholar. And I've tried to pay that forward over the years. I've mentored many students who become Rhodes Scholars, Marshall, Fulbrights, and all that. And that's a large part of what my company does. We raise awareness and say, hey, go forth. These are life-changing opportunities, right? I remember many years ago, I was helping a student to prepare for his mock interview for one of these scholarships. And that kind of thing is encouraged by the Rhodes Trust, by the way. And I remember posing to the student was a white student. I said, well, what if I raised an enigmatic affirmative action question. I said, look, you're a white kid, and here you are competing for a very prestigious scholarship. So what if I, on the committee, I say, look, we can only give this prize to one other student. There's another student here, just like you, except she's a Latina. She has wonderful, 4.0 GPA. She's been a scholar athlete. She's published. She's researched. She's been an amazing student leader, a great activist on campus and off campus. You're so similar. I said, but we can only give the scholarship to one of you. And you're white. She's Latina, part of a quote unquote protected class, historically discriminated against group, and she's a woman. What should we do? It's a hard question, right? It's not an unanswerable question, but it's a hard one. And the student hemmed and hawed for a minute, and then he kind of said, well, gee, I guess I would have to say, give it to her because it's fair or it's just. And I said, absolutely the wrong answer. I said, I would see that as absolutely the wrong answer. I would say that perhaps the best argument that you could make is that I know my own heart. I don't know what her heart is. Yes, we look great on paper, but I must advocate for myself because I know what I can do and I know what I stand for. And here's the alliance piece. There are some spaces which I can operate in as a white male that she would never be able to operate in with the same kind of way, given the systemic way in which white supremacy works in our society, with the way that differentiation occurs, the calculus of social value as it is articulated at the moment in our lives. So I have to advocate for myself because I'm still her colleague and I can do effective things as a white guy in these corners. Moreover, I know my own heart. So I think that's kind of where I would go with some of this. There were amazing, and I want to delve more deeply into this because I'm relatively a newcomer to this conversation too. I unpack this. I began to unpack this just over the last couple of months. I told Stephen about this, that this is a fascinating story. I didn't know about this, and I work in HBCUs, and my company interfaces with them to help the students prepare for, and to think about prestigious scholarships. I've also worked with predominantly white institutions to do that as well. And so the story, even about the Fulbright who was encouraged by a refugee scholar, resonated deeply in my own heart. So what's interesting about some of the conversations that the refugee scholars have with their students, that you see a real partnership. I mean, you saw real love in these relationships. These are people who said, look, you can do it. You have professors who say you can do this, and you had communities and faculty members and college presidents that we want you here. We want you to stay here. We want you to grow here. And there was this mutuality, and there was, as I think they mentioned in the film, a strange world within a world, that these immigrants had come to the United States, and then they had come at the same time to a segregated United States. And you had some of the refugee scholars saying, hey, look, this is very weird for me because I came from a place where I was persecuted and where I was the low guy on the totem pole, and now I'm seen as a member of the ruling class. I mean, I live in a white community while I teach in a segregated town, and they had to, and college, and so these had to say, well, how do I navigate that? Some did brilliant things. I think there's a story of Professor Berensky who integrates one of his classes. I think it's Professor Berensky who says, as one of the refugee scholars, he invites he creates a communal space where Black and white students come together for conversation. But he tells the students, I believe it's at Tougaloo College, his Black students, he said, come a little bit early to class and sit in every other seat. And that way, when the white kids came, they had to sit between them. And a community was forced, and awkwardnesses were overcome. So you had people very, very clear on how they were represented in society. but they also were clear as partners in terms of how they could use that representation for a greater good. And that to me, makes one a mensch. Yeah.
Thank you.
And the one final piece about I've also wrestled with this, because I sometimes get frustrated. I sometimes get frustrated with African American politicians who will say things like, we're a nation of immigrants. I'm like, I'm waiting for this other conversation, guys. We're not just a nation of immigrants. We're a nation of immigrants, and we're a nation of forced migrants. I'm looking for that day when we have not just that beautiful Statue of Liberty, but we have some kind of monument out there near Ellis Island, which also is a tribute to the forced migration of African and Afro-diasporic people. I'm looking for that monument for the Native American who was already here. So, I quietly at home, where I say things that I don't say in public, I quietly resent at home and very vocally the myopia of the narrative. That it's not just immigration. It's largely immigration, to be sure, but it's bringing out this lens so that we can see our total humanity and honor that. And one thing I didn't mention here is one of the things I often talk about is, and we're very clear on this in my theological tradition that, we will argue in the kind of Black liberation tradition that, Black folk have been largely the soul of America, and not soul in terms of Motown, but we've argued for the moral high ground, and we force ideas like King's speech about the check that has been told, insufficient funds. We've come to cash that check. The promise that you made, the promissory note that you said that we were all equal. Forget the part that a lot of people don't talk about, such as that, Thomas Jefferson's claims about his critique of King George, for instance, that was excised from the Declaration of Independence, was that damning piece when he said he's also incited the Black folk to rise up against us, and he supported the slave trade. And that was cutting a little too close to the bone for the Continental Congress. And they said, we got to take that out. So it's not as though folks didn't know of the American dilemma, the peculiar institution, the hypocrisy, but we decided to abide with it. And the joy for me as an African American, and one whose family has been here for hundreds of years, and who's like one of my great grandfathers named Moses, right? Someone from my tradition, there's pride in the fact that we have forced, and we continue to force, the moral high ground. We haven't always gotten it right, but we try to force that argument, which is part of our Judeo-Christian heritage too. So I thank my Jewish brethren and sisters for that as well. I'm excited about that. And we bring that fire, we bring a fiery theology about redemption. We bring a fiery theology about transformation. We're like Moses coming down the mountain. We are there to talk about really what we will say, thus saith the Lord, let my people go.
Well, thank you again.
Thank you.
Wow, it's almost like we should end there, but we may have more questions. That was amazing. It's an amazing explanation. Thank you, Dr. Long. Are there any questions from anyone else? You can turn your mic off. Just raise your hand, your Zoom hand, not your literal hand, so that Dr. Long can see it. I'm going to scan the pages to see. Perhaps some of the athletes that came in late will have a question to redeem themselves. I'm gonna give you another 10 seconds because someone recently told me in class that I don't give students enough time to come up with a question. Well, Dr. Long, that was a great talk. The tapestry you wove together, the education you gave us is moving. And I want you to know that I'm going to share this talk with others on this campus who couldn't be here tonight, which is why we recorded it. And with your permission, which I'll talk to you about later, not get later, but talk to you about later, I'd like to post it to YouTube and Facebook as well. It was just, what a tapestry you brought together for us. And I want to thank you, and I want to thank you for your optimism, especially at a time when optimism is sometimes hard to find. Thank you so much. And everyone,
Thank you.
thank you so much for coming. I'm impressed with the turnout, and I'm grateful for the turnout. I know that the students in particular are very busy. They have a lot of assignments due this week, and I know you're racing to go get to papers and study for exams. So thank you also for coming. Thank you all. Dr. Long, thank you too.
Thank you. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
Bye-bye, everybody.
Thank you.